These are some of the characteristics of good parenting. The first rule is to give only one warning before issuing a consequence. I use the word consequence for a particular reason. A punishment has to do with getting back at or exacting a pound of flesh when some mistake has been made. However, a consequence is simply something that happens, a limit or a result of one's behavior. A consequence ties reality together, and that helps children learn. If parenting is supposed to be about loving, teaching, and setting limits, giving them consequences rather than punishment would be the appropriate move. If a parent gives only one warning, it says to a child that the parent is a person of their word. They are consistent, they mean what they say, and they are someone they can count on. If a parent gives more than one warning, what they've really done is told the child that more chances are always to come, that they've got a little bit more room to wait, kind of like a snooze alarm. The child knows that, and so they push the limits even more. And then parents feel aggravated, but it was really a breakdown in parenting itself. In most cases, children's misbehavior is going to be exactly that. It's more about a breakdown of effective parenting than a bad child or a disturbed child. The second principle is to make sure the consequences that are used are natural and logical for the given situation. Natural consequences make sense, and they come right out of the actions themselves. If a person puts their hand on a hot stove, it will be burned, and therefore they will learn not to put their hand there again. But if somebody charged a person $50 for trying to put their hand on a hot stove, the person will feel things are unfair and be tempted to put it on the stove again. The consequence makes no logical sense. It's difficult at times to find a really logical consequence, but if parents really look hard enough, they really should be able to find it. The third principle is to be consistent and to follow through on any consequences given. If a parent is inconsistent, the child becomes confused. And if the child becomes confused, they become erratic. They don't know where their limits are and will actually push the limits all the more in an effort to find some sense of safety. Unfortunately, most parents often think that, again, it's an example of misbehavior. Only if children have lost hope and have been mistreated do they get to the point where they actually fight back and try to hurt. Number 4 is always to keep a calm, business-like tone to your voice. This tip is a whole lot easier to say than to do, but it is a hallmark of good parenting. One can only do that if they know that they're separate from the child. If they feel that the child is a reflection on them, if they feel their own shame because of difficulty with their own upbringing, then they're going to overreact. In other words, the parent is going to act childlike, and the child will not take the parent seriously. If the parent is calm and realizes that the behavior is just about a child growing and learning, then the parent will not overreact. There is another good reason to keep the voice calm. If a young person sees an older person get tremendously upset, that makes them feel very powerful. They don't really connect that they are hurting the older person. All they know is that they were able to get an adult to act like a kid, and that is marvelous to them. If a parent keeps detached and knows that children don't behave because that's the nature of being a child, then the parent can calmly tell them what they want done. If the parent gets hung up on controlling the behavior and getting their first desire, then there will be trouble. The parent should feel content with getting their second wish. And the second wish is always the teaching consequence. The fifth principle is to stay detached and to not take the misbehavior personally. Usually children are just testing limits, which is how they learn. They are not really challenging the parent. This is one of the most common mistakes that parents make. When they take things personally, they often drop down to the level of the child in their actions. It often degenerates into a power struggle. Only children can win power struggles because once a parent acts childlike, they lose all their credibility. The sixth principle is never to argue or discuss the issue with the child until after the consequence is given. Then reinforce and welcome the child back from the consequence with encouragement and discuss what took place. Parents often feel more comfortable with the encouragement and loving part of the job anyway. They want to discuss things and get a logical adult-to-adult decision with their children. Kids are often not capable of that when they're young. After the consequence is given, then reinforcing and welcoming the child back from the consequence begins to make real sense. And that's when you can discuss what happened and why it happened. This is applicable for rules that have already been talked about within the family. If it's a new situation, one in which the child would not understand what was happening, then a parent might want to talk with the child first. But if the child is talking back or making a mistake that is against the rules that they know about, the parent should rely on immediate consequences to help the child learn. If the child doesn't sit still and eat in a polite manner at the dinner table, then they simply shouldn't be allowed to finish that meal. They should go to their room. It's not going to kill them. They'll quickly make the connection between the behavior and the consequence. The seventh principle is to provide a quiet place for the time out and to isolate them from other family members. It is important to ignore the child's verbalizations while they are in time out. The time only starts after they are quiet and starts over if the child speaks or comes out of the room. The length of time out should be age appropriate, 1 minute for each age of the child. A parent needs to ignore the child's verbalizations while they are in timeout, and the timeout should only stop after they're quiet. If a parent has to hit or spank a child, it's a breakdown in parenting, especially if a parent hits with anger. It does not need to happen if one is an effective parent. A parent should take things calmly and do things in a business-like tone. They need to be consistent, act early enough so the behavior does not escalate, and they will not need to resort to physical violence. If a parent does resort to physical violence, a child is usually going to forget about whatever infraction they have committed, and they are going to focus on how badly they are being treated. If a parent treats a child unfairly, they will fight back. In a power struggle, the parent will always lose because a child can act more childlike than an adult for a longer period of time, and they will not stop. The timeout needs to be in absolute isolation. Timeout simply means that the child is going to take a little bit of time by themselves, taking them away from the family society and giving them a chance to calm down. It's a very effective way to do it. Anything the child says after they're in timeout should be totally ignored. Very often, parents will try to come in and negotiate or yell at the child to get them to stop. All that does is reinforce to the child that the parent is still involved, and one wants to take away all that involvement with a timeout. Isolation is painful enough for a child. A parent wants to make sure that the length of time stays age appropriate. 1 minute for each age of the child. Timeout provides a place for a child to learn about self-discipline. It's not punishing a child once he or she is already calm. Parents should make sure that whatever consequence is used is small enough in nature that if the child repeats the misbehavior again, time can get tacked on or doubled. So the child basically begins to learn that a parent really means business. If the parent starts with a gigantic consequence, or one that is not possible, such as you're grounded for the rest of your life, the child is not going to take it seriously. There's nowhere for the parent to go, and the parent has painted themselves into a corner. Usually, when someone makes an inappropriate suggestion for a consequence, it means that they are out of control themselves, not the child. The 8th principle is to work together as parents. If you disagree with a particular consequence, try waiting until after the incident to discuss it with your partner, and try not to take suggestions as a personal affront. Very often, I see one parent who plays good cop and another one who plays bad cop. And what they're really trying to do is balance each other out. In reality, one parent is probably much more comfortable with the encouragement and affection part of parenting, and another sees the discipline and limit setting as the more important task. If parents are split, they will try to balance each other out by moving further out into a skewed position. So if one parent feels that the other parent is being too lenient, they'll become more rigid. The more lenient parent will see that rigidity, and they will try to take an even more tolerant position. Eventually, there is no meeting in the middle, and the child will see and manipulate that split easily. This is not misbehavior. The child learns how to get their way, and that is what they're supposed to do. Only later will they develop a sophisticated conscience. The 9th principle is to use praise and encouragement often, but it is important not to use it excessively. Men often seem to specialize in limits and discipline, which is an important part of parenting. But encouragement and affection are equally beneficial. However, if a person uses praise too much, it begins to mean nothing to the child. Remember that up to the age of 12, children see things as black and white. They are unable to understand exceptions to the rule. If you exhibit inconsistency, they will believe they have been lied to. It is important to explain exceptions patiently to the child and not to expect too much. If a parent exhibits inconsistency often, the child will tend to believe that they've been lied to consistently, and the parent then has a difficult job of persuading them that there are even things such as exceptions. It's something that children will understand later in their development. The 11th principle is to keep in mind that children personalize absolutely everything. They are unable to see their mistakes are only about behavior. Instead, they will view it as if their personhood is bad, and they are themselves not good enough. This will produce shame, reiterate that mistakes are about behavior and not personhood. Children are unable on their own to make this connection. Therefore, it has to be taught to them patiently and often. The 12th principle is offer the child numerous opportunities to help with tasks that the parents are involved with. Children love to belong and to feel useful, especially when very young. They often become discouraged if told they are too young to be helpful. When this occurs, the child often becomes rebellious. The 13th principle is remember that children have a different sense of time than adults do. To them, 1 minute is an hour. Therefore, if you tell the child you will be back to talk with them in a minute and they begin to bother you in 10 seconds, they are really complying with what you have said. The 14th principle is to sometimes the best parenting is the least active. Think about intervention and whether it is needed or not. Children often resolve their difficulties with each other unless a caretaker tries to fix or control it too quickly. Interference could actually cause children to spend the rest of the day misbehaving just in order to finish the fight. Parents often try too hard. It appears that they're more worried about how they look to other people and if they're doing a good job. Therefore, they try to manage every little bit of behavior. It would be best if parents really pick and choose their battles. Most often, when they let children do things by themselves or trust the natural consequences to teach, things go much better. When I was doing my graduate work at University of Oregon, they had a wonderful family studies program there. And a particular instructor would take over an elementary school one Saturday a month, and he would invite everyone from Eugene, Oregon to come. They could bring their children, and the kids would be looked after by the counseling students. The parents could either get marital therapy or family therapy, and they could do that free as long as the counselors were able to observe and to watch. The teacher, Ray Lowe, would take half of the counselors and put them up in the bleachers, and then he'd watch the interaction with the kids and the other half of the counselors down in the orchestra pit. Invariably, one of the kids would come up and push another kid, and Ray would point out to the counselors up in the bleachers to watch how the counselors in the pit were going to respond. Before the other kid had a chance to push back, there were at least 3 counselors all over them. Because counselors love to help and they want to be involved, that's why they got into the field. For the rest of the afternoon, those kids would try to finish their original fight. The counselors would have to get involved over and over again, all to no avail. If the counselors did not get involved, didn't try to do any kind of interaction, the other child might push one more time, and then the fight would usually be over. The only time parents need to get involved is if it is really dangerous. It is helpful for children to try to take care of the problems themselves, and for the most part, they can do it. Therefore, the 15th principle is to be careful to discipline only when really necessary. Oftentimes, parents try to control their children because they themselves are responding to feelings that are coming from their own history and that do not match the present situation. An example would be when parents are feeling overly anxious by their child's behavior, when in reality, most people would not view their actions as misbehavior. This reinforces what I said at the very beginning of this video, which is that very often any unresolved issues out of childhood are brought back up again with the parent's own kids, especially when they are relatively close to the same age that the event occurred in the parents' lives. It's part of a repetition compulsion that is talked about more in the love addiction and dysfunctional family videos, as well as PTSD. It's uncanny the way this dynamic tends to keep recurring. It is the most dramatic and easiest to understand if a person was abused physically as a child. The overwhelming tendency is for them to abuse somebody else or to get abused over and over. And very often they take that abuse out on their kids when they're the same age as it occurred in their lives. It isn't deliberate, it just tends to happen naturally. but it is certainly a parent's job to figure that out and to stop it before it happens. If a parent feels overwhelmed, if a situation is creating too much emotion, they need to look at the idea that they might be reacting partly from their own history. They need to try to figure out what that history is and fix it themselves rather than to just try to fix the child. The 16th principle is to view discipline as teaching and caring, because that is what it is. There is no need to feel guilty for helping your child. Being firm with a child is absolutely fine. It's part of a parent's job.